In late 1914, the British launched an expedition from India to capture the German port of Tanga in East Africa. It was a massive logistical undertaking, requiring a fleet to cross the Indian Ocean and strike deep into enemy-held territory. Despite the mission being classified as secret, its details were visible to anyone on the docks of Bombay. Crates were labeled with their exact destination, radio messages were broadcast in the clear, and local newspapers openly announced the arrival of the force. Major-General Aitken was given command. A veteran of 35 years in India, Aitken believed the German Askari troops were untrained and would be easily defeated by Christmas. He based his planning on his own perceptions of racial and military hierarchy rather than scouting or intelligence. Aitken refused help from officers with local experience and dismissed warnings that the German-led native troops were a professional force. He bet the success of the campaign on the idea that his Indian soldiers would simply make mincemeat of the opposition. While Aitken called his troops magnificent, his intelligence officer, Captain Meinertzhagen, described them as some of the worst in India. He privately warned that the senior officers were nearer to fossils and feared what would happen if they met any serious opposition. The 8,000 men in the force were a fragmented group, speaking 12 different languages and following different faiths. Many had only recently received modern rifles they didn't know how to use, and some had never even met their commanders before boarding the ships. The men spent 16 unnecessary days aboard crowded transport ships in extreme heat, while their dietary needs were ignored, and by the time they reached the coast, the soldiers were suffering from severe seasickness and diarrhea brought on by unaccustomed food. When it was suggested at Mombasa that the men be allowed ashore to recover, Aitken refused. He insisted on taking his exhausted, sick army directly into the assault at Tanga. Upon arrival, Aitken refused to let his troops recuperate, fearing it would alert the Germans. In reality, the Germans had already been alerted by the British press and the visible fleet traveling down the coast. The cruiser HMS Fox entered Tanga Harbor to cancel the local truce. When asked if the harbor was mined, the German commissioner lied, saying it was full of them. The British commander believed him immediately. The fleet waited for hours while tugboats swept the harbor for non-existent mines. They found nothing but logs and oil cans, while the German commissioner used the time to rush back to his military unit. This delay gave the German commander, Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck, the time he needed. He immediately began moving his troops to Tanga by train. These Askari troops were the professional, disciplined force that Aitken had dismissed as untrained. They moved into defensive positions. A simple bluff about mines had traded the British momentum for German preparation. By the time the first soldiers stepped onto the beach, von Lettow-Vorbeck had already turned the town into a defensive trap. The British landing was chaotic. Supplies were dumped on the beaches at random, and the troops moved forward without scouting the enemy's positions. Aitken even refused naval bombardment, largely because he didn't actually know where the Germans were. The Indian troops struggled through 8-foot-tall cornfields in the midday heat. Many were already collapsing from thirst, having finished their water bottles before the engagement even began. The Germans utilized field telephones and hidden snipers in the trees to coordinate their fire. As the British advanced, they were met with invisible enemies and machine guns they couldn't locate. Hanging from the trees across the battlefield were log hives containing aggressive African bees. Infuriated by the noise and stray bullets, the swarms emerged and descended on the advancing troops. Panic spread as soldiers were stung hundreds of times. Fleeing back toward the sea, many troops mistakenly believed the bees were a cunning German weapon. The British assault broke. The soldiers were driven back by organized German fire and a local environment they had failed to prepare for. The casualty figures highlight the severity of the rout. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's forces lost fewer than 70. Evacuating, the British abandoned nearly all their equipment. The Germans captured a year's worth of supplies: food, blankets, motorbikes, and telegraph equipment. This included a massive stock of modern British rifles and machine guns. The evacuation effectively armed the German regiments for their next phase. The operation ended by achieving the exact opposite of its original goal. Instead of capturing the port, the British acted as an involuntary resupply mission for the enemy. The humiliation continued even after the fleet returned to Mombasa. Customs refused to let the army land until they paid a tax on their remaining equipment. For Major General Aitken, the fallout was personal. He was recalled to Britain, where the Secretary for War refused to see him. He was reduced in rank to colonel and retired on half pay. The campaign to capture Tanga had ended, with the fleet taxed for returning, its commander utterly disgraced, and the enemy fully equipped.